Marcus was a 12-year-old boy who loved simple things. Every afternoon, when the last school bell rang, he would sling his backpack over his shoulder and start the walk home. The road was familiar, lined with tall trees, quiet houses, and the sound of birds fluttering across power lines. Marcus enjoyed this walk. It gave him time to think, to hum little tunes he made up in his head, and sometimes to imagine himself as a hero in his own story. That day was no different. The sun was shining and a light breeze brushed against his face. His sneakers tapped gently on the sidewalk, keeping rhythm with the song he hummed. In his backpack were a few textbooks, some pencils, and a drawing he had made in class. He was proud of that drawing, a sketch of a rocket ship heading into space, and he couldn't wait to show it to his mom when he got home. Marcus lived with his mother, Angela, who worked long hours. Even though she was often busy, she always found time to listen to his stories about school, his dreams of becoming a scientist, and the small victories he had in class. Knowing she would be waiting at home gave Marcus an extra spark of happiness as he walked. The neighborhood he walked through was quiet and mostly safe, but Marcus sometimes felt eyes on him. Not from his friends or the kind neighbors who waved at him, but from others who looked at him differently. Still, he was just a boy trying to enjoy his afternoon, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. On that particular afternoon, Marcus noticed the smell of freshly cut grass drifting from a nearby yard. He slowed his pace for a moment to enjoy it. He liked how the green lawns looked like wide carpets, perfect for playing soccer or lying down to watch the clouds. He thought about asking his mom if they could play outside that evening, just like they sometimes did on weekends. As he continued down the street, Marcus pulled out a small comic book from his backpack. He had read it dozens of times before, but he loved the hero inside, brave, smart, and always standing up for the weak. Flipping through the pages as he walked, he smiled, completely lost in the adventure. For him, this was freedom. The walk home, the sunshine, the stories in his head, and the thought of his mom's smile waiting at the door. But even as Marcus felt at peace, someone else was watching him. Behind one of the curtains in a large white house, Karen sat with narrowed eyes. To her, Marcus didn't look like a harmless schoolboy. She didn't see the backpack, the comic book, or the innocence in his steps. She only saw what her imagination told her to see. A boy who didn't belong in her world. Marcus, of course, didn't notice her staring. He bent down for a moment to tie his shoelace, whistling softly. Then he stood back up and kept walking, unaware that the story of this ordinary afternoon was about to twist into something unforgettable. He thought about the snack he would eat at home, maybe cookies with milk, and how he would sit at the kitchen table telling his mom about his science class. To him, it was just another day, a beautiful walk under the sun. To Karen, it was something else entirely. She pressed her lips together, her hand already moving toward her phone. Marcus, still humming, still lost in his own simple world, had no idea that a single phone call would change everything. For now, though Marcus was just a boy walking home, dreaming about rockets and comic book heroes, enjoying the ordinary peace of an afternoon that felt like every other. His steps were light, his heart carefree, and his mind full of the possibilities tomorrow might bring. He had no reason to think anyone would interrupt his happiness. No reason at all. The air smelled sweet, the sky was clear, and Marcus smiled to himself as he reached the corner of the street. If only he knew that on the other side of that ordinary afternoon, his world was about to collide with suspicion, judgment, and a moment that would test not only him but also the strength of his family. Karen sat by her living room window, sipping her afternoon tea. The street outside was calm, the kind of calm she liked. She enjoyed quiet routines, watering her flowers, reading magazines, and watching who came and went in the neighborhood. To her, knowing everything that happened on the street meant she was keeping the area safe. But the truth was, Karen often let her imagination run too far. That day, her gaze landed on Marcus, the schoolboy making his way home. At first, she only noticed his small figure, the backpack bouncing on his shoulders, and his slow, steady walk. But instead of seeing what was really in front of her, a harmless child, Karen's mind filled the scene with suspicion. Who is this boy? Why is he walking here? I don't recognize him, she thought, frowning. She lived in the neighborhood for years and prided herself on knowing most of the families. She didn't stop to consider that Marcus lived only a few blocks away, or that he had walked this same path dozens of times. All she saw was someone she decided didn't belong. Karen leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as Marcus paused near a tree to retie his shoelace. To her, it looked like he was stalling, maybe even checking out houses. She whispered under her breath, "What's he up to?" Her tea grew cold on the table beside her, but she didn't notice. Her full attention was locked on the boy outside. Marcus, still lost in his comic book daydreams, had no clue he was being watched. He bent slightly to pick up a small stick, tossing it into the grass just for fun. Karen's heart quickened. Is he carrying something? Is he trying to hide something? She asked herself, letting her mind paint a picture of danger where none existed. She remembered stories she had read in the news, about break-ins, about strangers lurking in neighborhoods. She connected those headlines to Marcus without evidence, without reason. Her fears created a story in her mind, and in that story, Marcus was no longer a child, but a threat. Karen walked quickly to her kitchen counter and grabbed her phone. She held it in her hand but hesitated. Should I call? She wondered. She peered out the window again. Marcus was simply walking, humming to himself, flipping the corner of a comic book. Yet in Karen's eyes, every normal action looked suspicious. He's casing the houses, she told herself. He's pretending to be innocent. But I can tell something's off. She had convinced herself so fully that doubt no longer had room in her thoughts. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, her pulse racing. She felt a strange mix of fear and authority. Fear of the boy she imagined Marcus to be, and authority from the belief that she had the right to act. If I don't call, something bad could happen, she muttered. Better safe than sorry. What Karen didn't realize was how quickly her assumptions were becoming dangerous. One phone call could turn a peaceful afternoon into a frightening ordeal for a boy who had done nothing wrong. Yet at that moment, Karen didn't think about Marcus's feelings or the truth. She only thought about her own fears. As Marcus turned the corner near her house, whistling softly, Karen's mind made its final decision. She pressed the phone to her ear, dialing the number she thought would keep her neighborhood safe. Her eyes never left Marcus, even as she spoke into the receiver. Yes. Hello, she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. There's a suspicious young male walking around our neighborhood. He looks out of place. I think he might be up to something. Can you send someone to check it out? With those words, the ordinary afternoon shifted into something else entirely. Marcus kept walking, his mind filled with drawings and comic book heroes, unaware of the storm that had just been set in motion behind a window. Karen ended the call, her heart still pounding. She sat back in her chair, feeling both nervous and satisfied. She convinced herself she had done the right thing, that she had protected her street. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease in her stomach. For a moment, she wondered if maybe she had overreacted. Still, she pushed that thought away. No, she whispered to herself. I know trouble when I see it. And with that, she pulled the curtain just enough to keep watching, waiting for the police to arrive. The breeze outside carried the sound of Marcus's footsteps farther down the street. He was still smiling, still humming, still innocent. But soon flashing lights would interrupt his peaceful world. Karen didn't know it yet, but her decision would not only expose her bias but also collide with a truth she never expected. The boy's mother was not someone to underestimate. Karen's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the phone tighter. She had already convinced herself that she was doing the right thing. Still, there was a pause, a heavy silence where she wondered if this was truly necessary. Outside, Marcus walked peacefully, head bent over his comic book, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Nothing about him was threatening. Yet in Karen's mind, the ordinary seemed suspicious, and suspicion grew into certainty. She dialed the emergency number, her heart thudding in her chest. The ringing lasted only a second before a calm voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Karen inhaled deeply, forcing authority into her voice. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. It's a young boy, maybe a teenager, walking around like he doesn't belong here. The dispatcher, trained to remain neutral, asked, Can you describe what he's doing? Karen's eyes narrowed as she peeked again through her curtain. Marcus had stopped to tie his shoe, then adjusted the strap of his backpack. To Karen, even these small actions seemed deliberate. He keeps stopping, looking around. Like he's checking out houses. He's acting nervous. I don't recognize him. On the other end, the dispatcher typed notes into the system. What is he wearing? Karen replied quickly. He has a blue backpack, sneakers, and a red shirt. He's walking down Oak Ridge Lane right now. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea that his every innocent move was being narrated as though it were suspicious. He was still humming, still flipping through his comic book as he walked. He was simply a boy enjoying the sunshine, but Karen's voice painted him as something else entirely. The dispatcher pressed gently. "Is the individual threatening anyone or carrying a weapon?" Karen hesitated, biting her lip. She hadn't seen anything dangerous, but her mind filled the gap. "Not that I can see," she admitted, "but I have a bad feeling. I just know something's not right." That was enough. The dispatcher, following protocol, assured her, "All right, ma'am, we'll send an officer to check it out. Please stay inside and wait for their arrival." Karen's chest loosened. Relief washed over her. In her mind, she had done her duty. She hung up the phone and stood by the window, her eyes never leaving Marcus. A strange satisfaction crept into her thoughts. Soon the police would arrive. Soon someone would confirm her suspicions, or so she believed. Minutes passed. The street remained calm. Marcus had now reached the corner and paused at a stop sign, waiting to cross. Karen continued to watch, her emotions a mix of nervousness and pride. She imagined how grateful her neighbors would be when they found out she had acted quickly to protect the community. Marcus, however, was in his own little world. He glanced at the sky, admiring how the clouds looked like shapes, one like a dragon, another like a ship. He smiled to himself, wishing he could draw them later. His pace was slow, unhurried. He was a boy with time to dream, not a criminal. Then, faint in the distance, the sound of sirens broke the quiet afternoon. Karen's pulse jumped. Her eyes widened with a mix of excitement and fear. She had called for backup, and now it was arriving. Red and blue lights began to flicker at the far end of the street. Marcus looked up, confused. Sirens weren't common in his neighborhood during the day. He wondered if there had been an accident nearby. His steps slowed as the sound grew louder, the lights brighter. 2 police cars turned onto the street, their presence heavy and undeniable. Karen felt a rush of triumph. "See," she whispered to herself, "I knew something was wrong. The police will handle it now." She tugged her curtain back just enough to keep watching, her heart racing with anticipation. Marcus stopped walking altogether as the patrol car slowed near him. His eyes widened, his heart thumping. Fear prickled through him. He hadn't done anything, yet he suddenly felt like he was in trouble. One officer stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt while the other scanned Marcus carefully. The boy's throat went dry. He clutched his backpack straps tightly, unsure what to do. Why were they here? Why were they looking at him? Karen, hidden behind her window, leaned forward with satisfaction. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But what she didn't know was that this moment would not end the way she imagined. What she thought was a small act of protection would soon unravel, exposing her prejudice to the entire street. And as Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, blinking against the flashing red and blue lights, the story of his ordinary afternoon was about to turn into something much bigger than himself. The quiet street transformed the moment the police cars rolled in. Red and blue lights painted the white fences, the green lawns, and even the startled faces of neighbors peeking through their windows. The hum of ordinary life, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, was drowned out by the heavy presence of authority. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, his backpack strap still clutched tightly in his hands. His heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears. He wasn't sure if he should keep walking or stop where he was. He had never been in this situation before. All he knew was that the sirens, the flashing lights, and the sudden attention were meant for him. The first officer stepped out of his car, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform sharp under the sun. He adjusted his belt, where his hand hovered close to the radio in the holster. His partner followed, scanning the area, his eyes narrowing on Marcus like a spotlight. "Hey, you there," the first officer called out, his voice echoing down the street. "Stop right where you are." Marcus swallowed hard. His legs felt stiff as though glued to the ground. Slowly he nodded, his voice small. "Yes, sir." The officer took a step closer, his boots crunching against the pavement. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded. Marcus blinked, confused by the question. "I'm just walking home from school." He pointed weakly toward the direction of his house. "I live right down there." The second officer circled slightly as though trying to read Marcus's body language. "What's in the bag?" he asked firmly. "My school books." "My drawings," Marcus replied, his voice trembling now. He loosened the zipper, pulling it open enough to show the comic book sticking out. A half-finished math worksheet crumpled inside. Still, the officers' faces remained serious. The first officer spoke into his radio, murmuring codes Marcus didn't understand. The sound made his stomach knot tighter. Inside one of the houses, Karen's eyes gleamed with a strange satisfaction. From behind her curtain, she whispered, "Good, they're taking this seriously." She didn't see a frightened child. She didn't see innocence. She saw only her imagination confirmed by flashing lights and uniforms. But neighbors who had stepped onto their porches saw something else. An elderly couple frowned at the scene, recognizing Marcus from previous afternoons. They had waved at him many times before. Across the street, another neighbor whispered to her husband, "Isn't that Angela's son? He's such a polite boy." Marcus's chest tightened with embarrassment. He hated the way everyone was staring now. The way his ordinary walk had turned into a public spectacle. His fingers shook as he zipped his bag closed again. "Hands where we can see them," the second officer instructed. Marcus obeyed instantly, raising his hands just above his shoulders. His heart raced so fast he thought he might faint. He had done nothing wrong, yet somehow he was being treated like he had. The first officer softened his tone slightly, noticing the boy's fear. "What's your name, kid?" "Oh, Marcus," he stammered. "Marcus Carter." "And where exactly do you live, Marcus?" Marcus pointed again, his arm trembling. 3 blocks down. House with the red door." There was a pause. The officers exchanged a look as if silently debating. Was this really the boy they had been called about? He didn't fit the picture of a criminal. He fit the picture of a nervous, scared child. Still, protocol kept them cautious. The dispatcher's report replayed in their heads. Suspicious young male, looking at houses, doesn't belong. They couldn't ignore the call, but already doubts were creeping in. Marcus shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the growing number of faces in windows and porches. Shame burned inside him. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted attention. He just wanted to get home, to show his mom the rocket ship drawing in his backpack. Then down the street, the low hum of a car engine grew louder. A black SUV turned the corner, sleek and commanding, as though it carried authority even before the driver stepped out. Inside, Angela Carter gripped the wheel, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the flashing lights ahead. Her mother's instinct told her something was wrong. The sight of her son standing in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by 2 police officers, made her heart drop, but not with fear. With controlled, focused anger, the officers hadn't noticed her yet, but Marcus had. Relief washed over his face, his lips parting in a silent cry. "Mom." And at that exact moment, Karen leaned closer to her window. She saw the SUV, saw the tall woman stepping out in a dark suit, heels clicking confidently against the pavement. Karen's lips curved into a smirk. "Finally," she muttered to herself. "Now the parents will see why I called." What Karen didn't know was that this ordinary parent wasn't just Marcus's mom. She was someone who wore authority stronger than any police uniform. She was about to reveal a truth that would silence the entire street. The tension in the air was thick, ready to snap. Marcus's small, frightened figure stood between flashing lights and the unwavering stride of his mother. And though he didn't fully understand what was about to happen, one thing was clear. The ordinary afternoon was gone. What came next would change everything. Angela Carter stepped out of her black SUV, her heels striking the pavement in sharp, confident beats that echoed down the quiet street. She wasn't rushing, but every movement carried power. Her dark suit, perfectly pressed, contrasted with the flashing red and blue lights that reflected off the car's windows. For Marcus, the sight of his mother was like seeing sunlight break through a storm. His fear began to ease, though his body still shook from the confrontation. "Mom," he whispered, almost too quietly to hear, but the relief in his eyes said everything. The 2 officers turned toward the approaching woman. They recognized her type instantly, not just a protective parent, but someone used to authority. Her walk wasn't timid, nor was her face full of panic like most parents would be in this situation. Instead, she carried herself with calm precision, the kind that made people pause and wonder who exactly they were dealing with. "Ma'am, please stand back," the taller officer said, raising his hand in a firm gesture. "We're handling a situation here." Angela's eyes flicked from Marcus to the officers. She didn't slow her pace. Her heels clicked closer, her face expressionless. "I can see that," she said evenly. And the situation you're handling happens to be my son. The shorter officer glanced at Marcus, then back at Angela. Your son? His voice carried doubt, but Angela didn't flinch. Yes, she said simply, her tone like steel. Marcus Carter, 12 years old.
Walking home from school.
That's the so-called suspicious person you've stopped in broad daylight. The taller officer shifted uneasily. He hadn't expected this. Ma'am, we received a call from a resident. They said there was a young male acting strangely, looking at houses. We have to follow up on reports like that. Angela stopped a few feet from Marcus, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. The boy leaned into her touch, drawing strength from it. Her gaze locked on the officer's eyes, unwavering. And in your follow-up, did you see anything more than a child tying his shoes and carrying school books? The question hung heavy in the air. The officer cleared his throat, but no words came. The neighbors watching from their porches shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. Karen from behind her window smirked. She felt validated seeing the police explain themselves. Good, she muttered. Let her see her son isn't above suspicion. But Angela wasn't finished. She reached into her blazer pocket slowly, deliberately, her movements measured so neither officer would mistake her intention. She pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open with a practiced hand. The golden letters gleamed in the fading sunlight. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Both officers froze. The taller one's hand, still hovering near his belt, dropped immediately. The shorter officer's eyes widened, his mouth falling open slightly. This was not the parent they had expected. Angela's voice remained calm, but its edge sharpened like a blade. I am Special Agent Angela Carter, FBI, and you have just surrounded my 12-year-old son on the word of a neighbor who couldn't be bothered to tell the difference between a child walking home and a criminal. Marcus looked up at his mother with awe. He had seen her badge before, of course, but never like this. Never when it meant she was standing between him and danger. The taller officer stammered, We didn't know. That's the problem, Angela cut in, her tone rising slightly for the first time. You didn't know? You didn't ask. You reacted? Her eyes burned with restrained anger. This is a child, my child. And in less than 10 minutes, you've managed to turn his ordinary walk into a moment he will never forget. For all the wrong reasons. The officers exchanged glances, shame creeping onto their faces. The shorter one muttered, We were just following protocol. Angela straightened her shoulders. Protocol doesn't erase responsibility. Protocol doesn't erase the fear you put in my son's heart. You want to talk about protocols? Let's talk about the responsibility you have to question the reliability of a caller before treating a child like a suspect. Behind the glass, Karen's smirk dissolved into shock. Her teacup trembled in her hand as the words FBI agent repeated in her mind. She had wanted to prove something, but instead she had exposed herself. Marcus clung tighter to his mother's side, his small frame shielded by her strength. He felt safe now, though his chest still ached from fear. He whispered, Mom, I didn't do anything. Angela bent down slightly, pressing her forehead to his for a brief moment. I know, baby, she said softly, her voice now tender. I know. Then she turned back to the officers, her expression hard once more. Now, unless you want me filing a report with your captain, I suggest you explain to my son why this happened. Right here. Right now. The officers stood stiff, caught between duty and guilt. The weight of the moment pressed heavily against them, but they knew they had no defense strong enough to stand against the truth she had laid bare. And in that silence, the neighborhood realized something powerful. This wasn't just about a boy, a phone call, or even the flashing lights. It was about dignity, justice, and a mother who refused to let fear define her son's future. Karen's breath caught in her throat as the words, Special Agent, FBI echoed through her living room like a thunderclap. She had been leaning against the window, convinced her quick call to the police would make her the responsible neighbor, the one who kept the street safe. But now her hand shook so badly she nearly spilled her cold tea. From her hidden corner behind the curtain, she watched the scene outside transform. The police officers, who only moments ago stood tall and firm, now looked smaller somehow. Their backs were straighter, their tones quieter, their confidence stripped away by the badge Angela Carter had revealed. The authority had shifted. It no longer belonged to them. It belonged to her. Marcus leaned against his mother, his wide eyes darting nervously between the flashing lights and the crowd of neighbors. But there was no mistaking the relief that softened his features. For him, his mother's presence was like a shield, one no one could pierce. Karen's stomach churned. She had expected the mother to come out screaming or crying, maybe demanding answers. She had not expected a calm, powerful woman in a dark suit, holding a badge that carried weight across the nation. The realization struck like lightning. She had not just called the police on a child. She had called the police on the son of a federal agent. A wave of heat flushed Karen's face. She pulled the curtain tighter, hiding her expression. Her earlier pride, her smug satisfaction, crumbled under the weight of embarrassment. Her mind scrambled for excuses, reasons she could cling to. I was just being careful. I was just looking out for my neighborhood. I didn't mean any harm. But no matter how she tried to twist it, the truth stared back at her. She had judged a boy for the color of his skin, and now everyone could see it. Outside, Angela's voice carried like a blade slicing through the silence. My son deserves to walk home without being treated like a suspect, she said, each word deliberate, sharp, and impossible to ignore. And all of you, every single person watching, should think about what it means when a child can't take a simple walk without someone dialing 911. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others nodded faintly, agreeing but too afraid to speak. The elderly couple who had seen Marcus many times before whispered to each other, their disapproval aimed at the unseen hand that had made the call. Karen bit her lip so hard it nearly bled. She wanted to disappear into her carpet, to vanish from the weight of those words. Yet she couldn't tear her eyes from the window. She was frozen, her body locked between fear of being exposed and disbelief at the turn of events. The taller officer, voice shaking slightly now, cleared his throat. Agent Carter, we apologize. We didn't realize. Angela's gaze cut through him. You didn't ask. You didn't think. You let one biased phone call dictate how you treated a child. She glanced down at Marcus, brushing his hair gently away from his forehead. Do you have any idea what that does to a boy's mind? To grow up learning that innocence isn't enough to protect him. The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared to interrupt. Even the faint breeze seemed to pause. Karen felt sweat forming on her palms. She whispered to herself, almost as if trying to rewrite the story. I didn't know. I couldn't have known. But deep down she knew better. She had chosen suspicion over kindness, fear over reason. And now, the truth was standing on the street with a badge that carried more authority than all her excuses combined. The shorter officer finally lowered his eyes. You're right, ma'am. We made a mistake. Marcus looked up at his mother, his small voice breaking through. Can we go home now? Angela squeezed his hand. Yes, baby. We're going home. She gave the officers one last look, her eyes hard as steel. But this isn't over. Think very carefully about how you handle the next call, because next time it might not just be me waiting for answers. The officers stepped back, their shame visible in every movement. The flashing lights dimmed as one car slowly pulled away. The show of force had ended, replaced with the quiet humiliation of a mistake that could not be undone. From her window, Karen trembled. She wanted to open the door, to rush out and explain herself. But she knew no explanation would erase what she had done. Her silence was her only refuge, though it burned like fire inside her. Angela placed an arm around Marcus's shoulders, guiding him away from the scene. Neighbors watched them go, whispers following like shadows. Some whispered respect for Angela. Others murmured about the injustice Marcus had endured. But every whisper carried the same truth. A woman's fear had turned into a spectacle, and now her prejudice had been laid bare for all to see. And Karen, frozen behind the glass, knew her world had shifted. She hadn't just called the police. She had exposed herself, and nothing would ever look the same again. Angela's heels clicked against the pavement as she guided Marcus toward their car. But before she opened the door, she stopped. Her gaze drifted upward toward the White House with the pulled-back curtain. She had noticed the faint movement earlier, the way the fabric shifted whenever something happened on the street. Now she knew exactly who was hiding behind it. Her jaw tightened. She turned slowly, looking straight at the window. Even from inside, Karen felt the weight of that stare. It was sharp, unyielding, the kind of look that pierced through glass and silence alike. For a moment, Karen thought she might faint. Angela straightened her shoulders, her voice rising enough for the street to hear. You can come out now, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for escape. The neighbors glanced at one another. Heads turned toward the White House. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Karen froze in place, her breath shallow. She prayed Angela would just leave, but the silence stretched on. The world seemed to be waiting. Finally, with trembling fingers, Karen pushed the curtain aside. Slowly, awkwardly, she opened her front door and stepped onto the porch. Her face was pale, her hands clutching the railing for support. Angela kept one protective arm around Marcus, but her eyes never left Karen. "So you're the one," she said evenly. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I didn't mean," Angela's voice cut like steel. "You didn't mean?" "You didn't mean to terrify a 12-year-old child walking home with school books in his backpack. You didn't mean to make him feel like a criminal in his own neighborhood." Karen's lips trembled. I didn't know he was your son. I didn't know you were." Angela took one step closer, her eyes blazing. "That's the problem. You didn't care who he was. You didn't care what he was doing. All you saw was a black boy and you decided he didn't belong. That was enough for you to dial 911. The neighbors stood in stunned silence. Some nodded faintly, their expressions hard as they realized the truth spoken aloud. Others shifted uncomfortably, wishing the ground would swallow them to escape the weight of the confrontation. Karen's voice cracked. "I was just being careful. We've had stories about crime and—" Angela's voice rose, not with a scream but with controlled fire. "Crime? Marcus is 12. He's a child. He had a comic book in his hands, not a weapon. He was humming a tune, not breaking into houses. The only danger here is your prejudice and the damage it does." Marcus pressed closer against his mother's side, his eyes wide. For the first time, though, he felt pride instead of fear. His mother was not just defending him, she was defending every boy like him, every child who had ever been judged before they were even known. Karen's knees felt weak. She gripped the railing tighter, her eyes darting from Angela to the crowd. The neighbors' faces told her what she didn't want to admit. She had been wrong and everyone knew it. Angela's tone shifted slightly, quieter but sharper. "Do you know what you put at risk today? One call, one careless accusation. Do you understand how quickly this could have gone wrong? How easily my son could have been another name on the news?" Karen shook her head rapidly, tears brimming. No, I didn't think." "That's right," Angela snapped. "You didn't think. You assumed, and those assumptions nearly turned an ordinary afternoon into a tragedy." The silence was heavy now, every word hanging in the air. The officers, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. Even they felt the truth of her words echoing back at them. Karen's tears finally spilled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause all this." Angela studied her for a long, unblinking moment. Then she spoke softly, but her voice carried. "Sorry doesn't erase what my son just went through. Sorry doesn't erase the fear in his eyes when your call brought police cars to surround him. You can be sorry, but you need to do more than that. You need to change the way you see the world." Karen lowered her gaze, shame burning hotter than the sun above. She had nothing left to say. Angela turned back to Marcus, brushing his hair gently. "Come on, baby. Let's go home." Her voice softened only for him. As she opened the car door, the neighbors remained frozen in silence. Some looked at Karen with disappointment, others with quiet disgust. Karen wanted to retreat, to vanish back inside her house, but she knew no curtain would ever hide her now. Marcus climbed into the car, clutching his comic book tightly. Angela followed, her face calm but unyielding. Before driving away, she gave the street one last look, a silent promise that this moment would not be forgotten. And Karen, left trembling on her porch, realized the truth. In trying to expose a boy who didn't belong, she had only exposed herself. The street was quiet again. The flashing lights had faded, the police cars gone. The neighbors slipped back into their homes one by one, carrying whispers that clung to the air like smoke. But the silence didn't erase what had just happened. It lingered, heavy, like a mark no one could ignore. Marcus sat in the back seat of his mother's SUV, his comic book resting unopened on his lap. His small hands fidgeted with the edges of the pages, but his eyes were far away. The boy who had once hummed happily on his walk home now stared out the window, his innocence shaken. Angela glanced at him in the rearview mirror. She could see the weight pressing on him, the questions swirling in his young mind. She reached back, squeezing his hand. You didn't do anything wrong, she said softly. Don't you ever forget that. Marcus nodded, though the fear in his chest hadn't fully lifted. But Mom, why me? Why did she call them on me? His voice cracked, the pain raw and heavy. Angela's heart ached. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice before answering. Because some people see the world through fear, baby. They see color before they see character. They make judgments without knowing the truth. But remember this, you are not the problem. Their fear is. Marcus blinked, his young mind trying to hold on to her words. He wanted to believe them, but part of him still struggled. He hugged the comic book closer, as though the hero on the cover might lend him strength. Back on the porch of the White House, Karen sat slumped in a chair. Her teacup lay forgotten beside her, the liquid long since cooled. The weight of what had happened pressed on her shoulders like a mountain. She had thought of herself as a good neighbor, someone who looked out for her street. But now she couldn't escape the image of a frightened boy standing in flashing lights, hands raised because of her call. The truth gnawed at her. She had not protected her community. She had endangered a child. For the first time, Karen questioned the thoughts she had carried for years. Why had she been so quick to assume the worst? Why had she let fear take the driver's seat in her mind? She pressed her hands to her face, whispering into her palms, "What have I done?" The neighborhood would not forget. The whispers had already started, and they would not fade quickly. Some neighbors would forgive, others would not. But no one could erase the fact that she had shown her prejudice in the clearest way possible. Angela, meanwhile, drove Marcus the rest of the way home. When they pulled into their driveway, Marcus hesitated before stepping out. The world felt different now, less safe than before. Angela crouched down beside him, brushing his cheek gently. "You are strong," she told him. "Stronger than you know. Today was unfair, but it doesn't define you. What defines you is your kindness, your dreams, your courage. Don't let someone else's fear dim your light." Marcus managed a small smile, clinging to her words. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since the sirens, hope flickered in his eyes. That night, as the neighborhood settled into uneasy silence, the lesson remained like an echo in the air. It was more than just a story of a boy and his mother. It was a mirror held up to everyone who had watched. A reminder that fear and prejudice could twist the ordinary into danger, and that it was every person's responsibility to stop it before it happened again. Karen sat alone in her living room, the weight of her choices pressing harder with every tick of the clock. She thought of Marcus's frightened face, of Angela's sharp words, of the neighbor's disapproving eyes. For the first time, she understood that her actions had not just been a mistake. They had been a wound. And she wasn't sure how long it would take to heal. For Angela and Marcus, the day ended with quiet resilience. They sat together at the kitchen table, the comic book finally open, the rocket ship sketch lying between them. It was their small way of reclaiming normalcy. But even as they smiled, even as they shared cookies and milk, both knew the day had changed them. Marcus had seen how quickly suspicion could turn his world upside down. Angela had been reminded once again why she wore her badge, not just for justice, but to protect the innocent, especially her son. The lesson was carved deep into the neighborhood's memory. Prejudice could ignite with a single phone call, but courage could expose it just as quickly. And though the ordinary afternoon had been shattered, what remained was a story no one on Oak Ridge Lane would ever forget.